What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Jared Speaks, episode 20. 20 episodes. I want to sit with that for a second before we get into anything else today. 20 consecutive episodes, putting something real into a microphone when I almost didn't post episode 1. When I was close to just not doing any of this. I could not have pictured being here. 20 episodes of going places I did not plan to go, saying things I did not expect to say, and having people reach out to tell me they feel less alone because of it. That means everything. Every single person listening, whether you found this episode on episode 1 or just hit play for the first time today, thank you. Now, today's is a big one. We are going longer than usual because this topic deserves the room to get comfortable. Today, we're picking up a thread I've mentioned a few times on the show, but never given its full episode. The question of whether I am on the autism spectrum. I do not have a clean answer for you today. What I have is everything that has led me to ask the question seriously. The personal experiences, the research, the ways my whole life starts to look a little different when I hold this lens up to it. And I think walking through all of that honestly is more useful than either pretending I have it figured out or avoiding it because it feels too uncertain to say out loud. So let's go. It started with TikTok, the way a lot of things start now. I was going down a rabbit hole, and if you have ADHD, you know exactly how that goes. One video leads to another, and 2 hours later, you're somewhere completely different from where you started. And I kept landing on videos of adults talking about getting diagnosed with autism later in life, not as children, as adults. Sometimes in their 30s, 40s, or even older. Looking back at an entire lifetime through a new lens and finally having a word for something that they had been living with the whole time without understanding what it was. And I kept having this experience, video after video, person after person describing something about their inner life, the way social situations feel, the way certain things hit harder than they should, the exhaustion of being around people, even when you like the people, and thinking, that is me. Not once, but over and over. Different people, different words, same recognition landing in my chest each time. Since then, I've taken 3 different free online screening tests for autism, and I scored high on every single one. Now, that does not mean I have autism. I want to be crystal clear about that right now because I do not want this episode to become one more piece of content that leads somebody to decide something about themselves without real evaluation. What it means is something is worth looking at seriously. And today, that is where we are going. Before we go anywhere personal, I want to spend some real time on what autism actually is. because the public understanding of it so far from the full picture that most conversations about it are already off track before they start. Most people, when they hear the word autism, picture one thing: a nonverbal child, rocking back and forth, unable to make eye contact, meltdowns in public, profound support needs. And that is a real representation of autism that real people live with, and that deserves real understanding and support. But it is one end of a very wide spectrum. And for a long time, it was the only image that got any representation, which means that everyone whose autism looked different, quieter, more internal, more hidden, went undiagnosed for decades, sometimes their entire lives. Autism is a neurological difference, a difference in how the brain processes information, navigates social situations, and responds to sensory input, and organizes the world. It is not a disease, it is not damage, it is a different operating system. To use language we have already used on this show. And like any operating system, it has its own strengths and its own friction points. And those vary enormously from person to person. The spectrum is not a straight line from mild to severe. It's more like a multidimensional space where any given person might be very different in different areas. Someone might have significant sensory sensitivity but strong language skills. Someone might excel socially in structured settings and fall apart in unstructured ones. Someone might have built such a through set of coping strategies over decades, and their autism is completely invisible to everyone around them, including sometimes to themselves. That last category is the one that became a focus of more recent research, and it is the category that started making me pay attention. Let me be honest about what these online tests are and what they are not, because I think that is important. The most common tools used as a first screening step are things like AQ, the Autism Spectrum Quotient, and the RADS-R, which stands for Ritvo Autism and Asperger Diagnosis Scale Revised. These are real instruments. They were developed by actual researchers. Clinicians use them as a part of a larger evaluation process. What they are not is a diagnosis. They are a signal. A high score on a free online version means you relate strongly to the kinds of experiences the test is measuring. It means a conversation with a qualified professional about this is probably worth having. It does not mean you have autism. It does not mean that you do not. It is the start of a question, not the end of one. I scored high on 3 of them across different tests that measure the same territory from slightly different angles. That consistency is what made me take it more seriously rather than chalking it up to a random result from a single quiz. I want to spend a minute on the word spectrum because I think it gets misunderstood in a way that matters for this conversation. When most people hear that autism is a spectrum, they assume it works like a sliding scale. More autistic on one end and less autistic on the other. And people are just somewhere along that line. That is not how researchers actually understand it. Think of it more like a color wheel than a straight line. A person is not just a little autistic or a lot autistic. They have a specific profile, a particular combination of traits, some more prominent than others, some masked by learned behaviors, some only showing up under stress or fatigue or in situations that push past what their coping strategies can hold. Two autistic people can look completely different from the outside and have almost nothing in common in terms of how their autism presents. What they share is not the same surface behavior. It is an underlying difference in how their nervous system processes the world. That is actually what made me start paying closer attention to all of this. Because I was not looking for one specific thing that matched the stereotype. I was looking at a whole pattern. And the more I looked at the pattern, the more of my own life started to fit inside of it. If there was one concept in the autism research that stopped me completely and made everything else start clicking into place, it is masking, also sometimes called camouflaging. Here's what it means. From a very early age, sometimes before they have even have conscious awareness that they're doing it, some people learn to study and replicate the social behaviors that come naturally to other people. Eye contact, small talk, the right facial expression at the right moment, the unspoken rules about when to speak and when not to, and how close to stand, how long a pause should last before it comes afterward. A lot of that social navigation that most people just do automatically without thinking because it comes wired in. For some people, none of that is automatic. It is learned, studied, consciously performed, even when it looks completely natural from the outside. And the effort required to maintain that performance, hour after hour, day after day, is exhausting in a way that is very hard to explain for someone that does not live it. Because from the outside, you just look like a normal, socially functional person. The effort is invisible. The exhaustion is invisible, but it is real. I've talked on this show about being a mirror and how my whole life I adjusted, reflected back whatever the room needed, changed my accent within months of moving somewhere new because people were mocking the one I grew up with. Learned to read what people expected and I delivered it. Became whatever version of myself fit the situation well enough to belong. I called that being adaptable. I thought it was a skill. I'm starting to wonder if it was survival. But the masking research describes exactly that. not someone who is naturally flexible and easygoing, someone who learned very early that their natural way of being in the world was not landing the way it should, and development as an entire system of adjustments to compensate. A performance so thorough and so practiced that it becomes hard to separate from the actual self. That question, who am I actually underneath all the mirroring, is one I've been asking on this podcast since almost the beginning. And now I'm looking at it through a different lens I did not have before. Let me try to describe something I think a lot of people who relate to autism experiences will recognize. A lot of people who do not will probably not fully understand until I lay it out. Being around people is tiring for me in a way that does not match how it looks from the outside. I can be fully engaged in a conversation, present, interested, contributing, and afterward need to completely decompress alone in a way that goes beyond just being introverted. It is not that I do not like people, I genuinely do. I care deeply about the people in my life. I can have real conversations that mean something and walk away feeling like that mattered. But I also walk away needing to step back from the world for a while. Not because the conversation was bad, because the conversation cost something that quite alone time is the only thing that replenishes. I replay conversations afterward, not because something went wrong necessarily, just a kind of review that happened on its own. Did I say the right thing? Did that land the right way I meant it? Was that too much? Was that not enough? An automatic post analysis that runs whether I ask it to or not. And certain social situations that other people seem to move through easily feel genuinely difficult to me in ways I've never been able to fully explain. Unstructured social settings where there are no clear rules or roles. Small talk with strangers where I cannot find a real thread to follow. Situations where I am supposed to know what to say and I genuinely do not. Not because I have nothing to say, but because the social code for that particular moment is not readable to me the way it seems to be for other people. All of that is documented in what autistic adults describe about their experience, particularly the late diagnosed adults who spent decades masking well enough that nobody around them ever questioned whether something was different about how they were wired. Here's one that people do not always associate with high functioning or late diagnosed autism, but shows up consistently in the research. Sensory sensitivity means the nervous system processes sensory input, sound, light, texture, temperature, smell more intensely than the standard baseline. Things that other people filter out naturally and do not consciously register can hit loud and hard and persistently in someone whose sensory processing is turned up higher than average. We talk about this in episode 2 when we talked about ADHD and the filter. The idea that some nervous systems let more through, that what gets called oversensitivity from the outside might actually be more open filter the inside. Autism involves a very similar dynamic. The sensory world can be more vivid, more intense, more demanding of attention and energy to navigate. Certain sounds that other people tune out completely can be genuinely uncomfortable. Certain environments that feel fine to most people can be overwhelming in a way that is hard to explain without sounding dramatic. Because from the outside, nothing looks wrong. The sound level is the same for everyone. The lights are the same. But the experience of them is not. I have always been sensitive to my environment in ways I kind of just accept it as quirks. Certain sounds that loop in my head longer than they should. Certain textures that I notice when other people do not seem to. A strong reaction to being in certain kinds of spaces that I could never quite explain logically. I'm not saying any of that definitely means autism. I'm saying that it fits a pattern I am looking at honestly for the first time. If you've listened to episode 2, you know we talked about hyperfocus in the context of ADHD. The ability to lock onto something that captures your attention and stay locked for hours, losing track of time, forgetting to eat, the rest of the world just fading away completely. Autism has something similar, but with its own specific quality. What researchers call special interest. Topics or areas that are not just interesting, but feel almost necessary. That you can go very deep into for a very long time. That you return to naturally and repeatedly. That you can talk about with a level of detail and enthusiasm that other people sometimes find surprising given how long you've already been talking about the same thing. In autism research, these special interests are not pathologized the way hyperfocus sometimes in ADHD conversation. They are increasingly recognized as one of the genuine strengths of the autistic profile: deep expertise. The ability to go further into something than most people ever bother to go. I have had this conversation and versions of this my whole life. Topics that were not just hobbies, but genuine obsessions. Consciousness and the mind and the unseen parts of human experience being the most current and obvious one, which is essentially the entire backbone of this show. When I started this podcast, I did not have to work to find things to say about consciousness and metacognition and the ego and the filter and the paranormal. It was just already in me, already there, already organized in a way that I could talk about it for hours and still feel like I had only scratched the surface. That energy, that particular quality of deep, sustained engagement with a specific set of ideas is something I am looking at differently now. I've mentioned my pattern recognition on this show a few times, described it as a high tier, something I trust, and also something I know can sometimes find patterns where none actually exist. Pattern recognition is something that often runs high in autistic people. Not in all of them, and not in the same way, but the ability to notice details, to find connections between things that other people do not immediately see, to track patterns across information that shows up consistently and enough in the autistic experience that it is worth naming here. It connects directly to the way I described myself in episode 3 when we talked about the Mandela effect. The way my brain works through patterns and connections faster than I sometimes realize it is doing. The way things line up in my mind before I have consciously decided to line them up. I have always experienced thinking more as noticing than as deliberate construction. Like the connections are already there and I'm just catching up to them. That might be just how particular my mind works. Or it might be a larger piece of the picture. And I'm only now starting to look at it directly. I already have an ADHD diagnosis confirmed. That is not something I am questioning. But I want to talk about how ADHD and autism interact because I think this is genuinely important and not widely understood. There is a growing body of research on what gets informally called ADHD, being both autistic and ADHD at the same time. For a long time, those two were considered mutually exclusive by clinical guides. If you had ADHD, they would not diagnose autism and vice versa. That changed with the DSM 5 in 2013, which removed that exclusion and acknowledged that both can and do occur together in the same person. And they look different together than either one does separately. Because ADHD is partly about difficulty with inhibition and regulation, the brain that will not stay on task, that chases stimulation, that fires multiple directions. Autism involves a different kind of processing, more rigid in some ways, more deeply wired into certain patterns. more reliant on systems and predictability. When both are present in the same nervous system, the results can be a combination that masks both conditions from the outside. The ADHD impulsivity might make the autistic preference for routine less visible. The autistic pattern recognition might make the ADHD distractibility look more organized than it is. A person can be genuinely struggling with both while appearing from the outside to be just a complex, unpredictable, hard to categorize person. That last description has fit me most of my life. Complex, hard to organize. People who knew me well, knowing there was something specific about how I worked with being able to name it without being able to name it. Me knowing the same thing without being able to name it. The bipolar overlap and the question I have to address. I talked about this in episode 19, so I do not want to go over the whole thing again, but I need to address it here because it is the thing complicating all of this. I was just diagnosed with bipolar type 2. Two therapists independently looking at two different windows into my life, landing on the same conclusion. And now I'm also telling you I relate strongly to autism experiences and scored high on 3 screening tools. The obvious question is whether those two things can both be true. And the honest answer is yes, they can. Bipolar disorder and autism are not mutually exclusive. A person can have both. Having one does not prevent or explain away the other. But there is also a real and documented issue in mental health where autism has been missed and something else has been diagnosed into its place. Autistic burnout. The state that happens when an autistic person has been masking and pushing past their limits for too long. Can look from the outside like a depressive episode. The sudden inability to function that comes from a crashed nervous system can look like a mood disorder. Meltdowns can be mistaken for bipolar episodes by clinicians who are not specifically looking for autism and do not have the full context. I'm not using that to talk myself out of the bipolar diagnosis. I'm not doing that. I experienced a real hypomanic episode with specific clinical features that lined up genuinely and clearly. That was not autistic burnout. I know the difference from the inside. What I am saying is that the autism question deserves its own proper evaluation, separate from and alongside the bipolar work, not instead of it, alongside it. There's a reason so many people are getting diagnosed with autism as adults right now. And I want to talk about it because I think it is important context for why I am in the position I am in. For most of the history of autism, research, the clinical image was built almost entirely from studies of young boys with significant support needs. The criteria were developed around that population. The symptoms that got identified and codified were the most visible ones, the ones that showed up clearly and early in children who were not masking, who could not mask, whose differences were apparent to every observer from the start. That meant entire groups of people were invisible to the diagnostic system. Autistic girls and women who tend to mask more effectively from their earlier ages and whose presentation often looks different from the male pattern profile, the criteria were built around. Autistic people with high verbal ability and strong academic skills, whose competence in certain areas made their struggles in others easier for people to overlook. And autistic people who grew up in environments that demanded conformity, that taught them from very early to hide anything that made them stand out. Who got so good at performing neurotypically that nobody ever thought to look underneath. A lot of those people are adults now, many of them with decades of unexplained experiences, of feeling like they were working harder than everyone else to do things that seemed to cost other people nothing, of never quite fitting in when they appeared to fit, of a persistent sense of observing life slightly from beyond the glass, even when they were in the middle of it. Online content about adult autism diagnosis has created a space where those experiences finally have a language attached to them, where someone can hear another person describe the specific quality of their exhaustion after a social event and think, I thought I was the only one. That moment of recognition is real and it matters. The risk is that the recognition itself gets treated as confirmation. That the this sounds like me moment for it short circuits the more rigorous process of actual evaluation. And that is why I keep coming back to the same point. The recognition is where the question starts, not where it ends. I want to be genuinely useful here because I know some of you listening are in the same, I think I might be, but I don't know how to find out for sure, place that I'm in. A proper autism evaluation for an adult is not just a longer version of the online quiz. It typically involves a structured clinical interview that covers developmental history going back to childhood, because autism is present from birth, even when it is not identified until adulthood. And patterns from childhood provide important context. It may involve standardized assessment tools administered by a trained clinician rather than self reported on a website. It looks at the whole picture, multiple areas of functioning, the presence or absence of other explanations for the patterns being observed, how the experiences being described actually impact daily life. The DSM 5, the diagnostic manual clinicians use, describe the criteria for autism spectrum disorder in terms of two main areas: differences in social communication and interaction, and restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities. For an adult diagnosis, it also requires that these patterns have been present since early development, even if they were not recognized or identified at the time. My therapist mentioned early on that we would go through a more formal assessment process together, and that conversation has not happened yet. The bipolar diagnosis has taken up most of our recent time, but I plan to bring this directly to him, not to prove or disprove anything in advance, but to actually go through the process rather than living in the uncertainty indefinitely. If you are in a similar place and wondering how to start, bringing it up directly to a therapist or doctor is the right first step. Saying, I've been relating to autism experiences and scored high on a screening tools, and I want to actually evaluate this properly. That's a complete and reasonable thing to say to a mental health professional. I want to close out the meat of this episode by pulling a thread I think connects all of this back to what Jared Speaks has been doing since episode 1. This entire show has been about looking at the way the mind works from the inside. The filter, the ego, the shadow, the inner voice, the patterns that run automatically underneath conscious awareness. Episode after episode of turning the flashlight inward and asking, what is actually happening here? And how much of it have I been taking at face value without really examining it? The autism question is the same inquiry applied to the most fundamental level. Not just why do I react this way or why do I think this way, but why does the basic experience of being in the world feel the way it does for me? Why does social interaction cost what it cost? Why does the same environment that other people walk through without a second thought sometimes feel like running through something thick. If the answer turns out to involve autism, that is not a diminishment of anything I have figured out or built or become. It is another layer of context, another piece of the picture of why this particular mind works the way it works, and why the work of understanding it has always felt necessary rather than optional. I was not going to figure out the filter or the ego or the shadow through willpower and performance. I was going to figure it out by actually looking. This is the same. I want to hear from you on this one more than almost any other episode I have done. If you've been through a late autism diagnosis as an adult, I want to know what the process was like. What made you finally seek a real evaluation rather than I'm just living with the question? What changed when you had an answer? And if you're in the same place I am, relating to a lot of what I described today, sitting with the question without an answer yet, I want to hear that too. What specific things do you recognize? What has always felt like it needed explaining? Drop it in the comments. I think there are a significant number of people listening to this show right now who have been carrying this question quietly for a long time. And this is the place to say it out loud. That is episode 20, everybody. A longer one today. And I think it earned the length. I do not have a diagnosis to report. I do not have a verdict. What I have is a question I'm taking seriously for the first time. A pattern that is worth actually examining rather than explaining away. And a real conversation coming with my therapist that I'm not going to keep pushing to the back of the agenda. Whatever the answer turns out to be, I am not afraid of it. A word for something you've been living with is not a limitation. It is a map. And a map is only useful if you're willing to look at it. Follow the show on Spotify, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, or YouTube. Leave a rating if you can. And share this one if it sounds like something somebody in your life needed to hear. New episode tomorrow. Stay curious, take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you then.